Hello, this is Mr. Coates, and this is APES lecture number 19, Forestry, the Basics. Forests are one of those renewable resources we have throughout the planet. Forests can be used in numerous different ways, and so we're going to look at those ways as well as how we manage some forests, specifically here in the United States. Now, there are different types of forests out there. The first one we need to know about is old growth forest. Old growth forests are those forests that have not been cut and have not been regenerated. They've not been bothered basically by human activities for several hundred years. You get very large trees in the stand of forest, and typically you have no understory. So if you look at this picture here, this is a picture of old growth forest in the northwest United States. And you see very large trees here. There's probably a diameter tree here of probably 8 to 10 feet. But there's no large plants growing underneath on the forest floor. You have mosses and things that don't need a whole lot of light, but you don't have large plants. So there's no understory in an old growth forest. Unfortunately, in the United States, old growth forest is very rare. Most of the old growth forest in the United States is protected now in national parks and national forests. There's a lot of pressure not to cut them down in places where they can be cut down. So that's a problem here in the United States. We've really used most of our forests in the past building or using them as fuel. After you cut down a forest and let a new forest grow, then we have secondary forests. And most of the forests in the United States are secondary forests. And the good thing is, in the United States, a lot of the forests that we cut down have grown back into secondary forests. Now, they're not as mature as an old growth forest. They still have some maturing to do, but they're getting better all the time. The other thing to know is that when we take down trees in forestry operations, we tend to replant with what we call a monoculture. It's basically all the trees are the same species. That is not very good for biodiversity, and so we get what we call these tree plantations, where you have all just one species of tree growing, and then later on that area of forest will probably be harvested again and replanted. In the world, there are other countries that do a much better job of preserving their old growth forests. Russia, Canada, Brazil, some places in Indonesia are very good at keeping their forest. However, in some of these places, particularly in Brazil and also in Indonesia, those forests are being threatened due to the harvest of some of the special wood types like mahogany and some of the other rare tropical woods. But currently, those are the places with the most old growth forests. Now, if we look at maps here, it shows the trend of how old growth forests went away in the United States. In the 1620s, when Europeans were coming into this country, we had mostly our old growth forests throughout most of the country. These dark areas are where all the old growth forest existed prior to the Europeans coming in. If you just see white, then that's an area that didn't have forest. So we're talking about the Great Plains that don't have forest, and then some of the desert regions that don't have any forest here, and then of course down here in Florida, the Everglades, not considered a forest. But all the other places like the Northeast and upper Northwest here all had great forests. As time went on, in the 1850s, we started moving from the East Coast deeper into the country, and our forests were disappearing. Once again, we were building buildings with them. We were using them for wood. We were clearing the area for crops. And by 1926, most of the old growth forests in the United States were gone. And so if we look at the latest picture I have here is 1990. Old growth forests typically happen in some of our national parks. This up here is Yellowstone National Park, and this is Sequoia National Forest here, and then there's a whole bunch here in Oregon that are also old growth forests. The good thing is that these areas that are not old growth forests, they have come back really well with secondary forests. Also, when we use forests, we tend to manage them one of two ways. We either manage them with even age stands, or we manage them through uneven age stands. An even age stand means that when we harvest an area of forest, we cut down all the trees and replant with the same size tree. So as the forest grows, all the trees in that forest are the same age. Now, once again, this doesn't do much for biodiversity. Now, in an uneven aged management strategy, only some of the trees are cut down. And so then they are replanted, and so you end up with a forest with different aged trees throughout the forest. This is much better for biodiversity and also the genetic diversity of the forest. Unfortunately, you don't get as much bang for the buck when you do it that way. We tend to, in this country, do mostly even age management. There are also several different types of lumber techniques that we need to know about. The first one here is called selective cutting. Selective cutting, the foresters go into the forest that is to be harvested and they mark the particular trees that will make good for whatever use they need, whether they need it for pulpwood for paper, or do they need it for lumber. Whatever they need that wood for, they'll go through and they'll select the best trees for that, and they'll only cut those trees down, trying not to harm any of the other trees. Now, there are different types of selective cutting out there. One is called shelter wood cutting, and shelter wood cutting, they will leave some of the bigger trees around in order to protect smaller trees from any kind of environmental extremes like wind or extreme cold. Another way that they can do this to protect other trees is that they can do seed tree cutting. And what they do is that they'll harvest maybe the middle-aged trees and then leave the oldest trees and the youngest trees and let the oldest trees repopulate the area with seeds. And so then you'll start getting new trees coming in. They can be harvested later. So that's seed tree cutting. So those are definitely different types of selective cutting techniques. Unfortunately, the technique that is used most often is what we call clear cutting. Clear cutting removes all of the trees. And if you see here, you see an area that's down here in this photograph where all the trees have been removed out of this area and there's nothing left. And most forestry operations will go back in and replant this area once again with the same species of trees. But the problem is that a lot of times in clear cutting, this doesn't happen, this replanting doesn't happen right away. And so you get a lot of soil erosion, you lose a lot of nutrients from the soil, and of course the habitat is basically gone in this area from what it used to be. And so clear cutting is not the best way environmentally to cut these trees. However, for some trees, fast-growing trees, particularly like spruce and some of the pine trees, this is economically the best way to do it. And like I said, unfortunately, that happens too often here in the United States. There are some variations to all of this type of cutting that they can implement to protect the forest and kind of increase the diversity or maintain the diversity. One is called strip cutting. And in strip cutting, they'll just cut a strip of trees and leave a strip in between and then cut another strip of trees. This is a little bit different than selective cutting because you're cutting all the trees in the strip. You're not leaving random trees, so it kind of looks like furrows or rows. So you can kind of see some strip cutting in this picture over here, these areas where you have these veins. There's been strips that have been cut and then strips that have been left. Now also, this technique in this particular picture is combined with checkerboard pattern. So they have harvested only this checkerboard right here and left this checkerboard intact. And what that does, that improves the diversity. It creates seed trees, so new trees can get planted or grow in these other areas. And it also stabilizes the soil. So this is actually a better cutting technique. Unfortunately, it is also not used very often because it's just too difficult. For the species of trees in this, it worked okay. These are hardwood trees, not softwood trees like spruce and Douglas fir. And then you can have whole tree harvesting as well. We don't see this too much in the United States. Typically the stumps are left behind. But in whole tree harvesting, the entire stump is removed and probably ground up for pulpwood. And you're left with just bare ground. Once again, this is actually even worse than clear cutting because there's nothing left to hold the soil in. And this has to be planted right away. And if it's not planted right away, you're going to get a lot of soil erosion and soil degradation. Now, one other management technique to forest is forest fires. A lot of forests need occasional fire. There are actual species in the forest that can't reproduce without fire. There are a lot of pine trees that do this. Their cones don't open up fully, releasing seeds until they are hit with the heat from fire. So some forest fires are good. They also clean out a lot of the fallen limbs and fire tinder that is built up on the forest floor. And so this type of fire that is only on the surface of the ground here is a good type of fire for most forests. Usually it leaves the oldest, healthiest trees. They don't burn. And then leaf litter on the bottom gets recycled into ash and provides more nutrients for the forest. A lot of organisms really rely on this type of fire in order to complete their life cycle. And so these type of fires are good. However, we have bad fires like this one up here. This is a picture as well as this one down here. These are called crown fires, and these are very hot fires. They're very fast moving fires. The fire gets into the top of the trees here. The entire tree is killed, and you're left with basically no forest whatsoever after a crown type of fire. And these are very dangerous. Like I said, they move very fast. These are the ones that are fueled by heavy winds, and they can burn down a lot of man-made structures and injure a lot of wildlife. This picture down below, this is a famous picture from Yellowstone Fires back, I think in the early 80s, and it shows that wildlife, there are deer down here taking refuge in a river as this fire raged out of control. And in this fire, over a third of Yellowstone National Park burned. There is a third fire type, and you see this in Florida sometimes. And underneath that forest is a buildup of organic matter called peat. And that peat can be combusted. And this peat can be deep underground, and so the fire gets underground and smolders for long periods of time. These are called ground fires, and ignite surface fires if they're left alone. And they're very difficult to put out because they are underground and they just smolder and produce a very acrid smoke. Now, we do have fire protection in place in the United States. One of the biggest things we ever did was the Smokey the Bear campaign. This is basically an education campaign on how to avoid forest fires that are caused by humans. So they did all kinds of things like put up fire notices when you enter up national forests saying if the fire danger is high or not, and Smokey Bear went around to all the elementary schools and made friends with the kids, and the education campaign was huge in trying to get forest fires under control that were made by man. However, we do make some fires on our own that we're supposed to make. One is called prescribed burning. As I said, a lot of times in a forest, a lot of brush gets built up in a forest, and that can be a really bad thing. So one of the things that we've learned to do in order to manage our forest better is to purposely burn this area and try and do it in conditions that don't create dangerous fires. So we wait until the humidity is pretty high, we wait until that the ground is a little wet, the trees are wet, and we start a fire and burn just the leaf litter and the sticks that have built up and the brush that have built up underneath the trees, and leave the trees whole. And so that's a really good thing to do. Now, unfortunately, the other way we can do it is after the fire is already started. And so this is why we built forest fire towers. You climb up to, and there were men stationed up in these towers that would look out over the forest and triangulate fires and basically be the first people to know about these fires and send the firefighters to them before they got out of hand. This doesn't happen too much. We still have those towers, but a lot of them aren't manned anymore. We're doing most of this through remote sensing via satellites or just by aircraft now, and so you don't see that too much. But this is early detection and extermination of small fires when they first get started. The last resort then is if you get a fire that's out of control, then you have to suppress it. And this is when you get a lot of what they call smoke jumpers, which are the guys that put out fires in the forest. And then you get a lot of planes dropping retardant and water on the fires. And often it's very expensive to control fires in this manner. And these are the fires we really want to avoid. Unfortunately, in the news, these are the only fires we really hear about. Well, I hope that answered some questions for you about forest protection and the way we manage some forests here in the United States. If you have any questions, please bring them to class.